Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences. Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Today we welcome our guest Owen Flanagan and take a philosophical look at addiction. Like most of you, I have loved many addicts in my life, sometimes with great reward and often with great pain and loss. I also grew up in Washington Heights in New York City in the 1970s and 80s, which was the geographical epicenter of the crack epidemic. So I was literally surrounded by addiction. I was raised amongst violence, desperation, dysfunction, and injustice. I was so attuned to the pain and suffering of those around me that I didn't have my first sip of alcohol until I was 25 and, with the exception of one afternoon when I was 13, didn't try marijuana until I was in my 50s. I was terrified I had an addictive personality hiding in plain sight. Genetics are a bitch. There's a lot going on in these admissions. I'm describing personal and political relationships. I'm referencing vast social influences and economic forces. I'm contrasting personal decision-making with biology. I'm recalling a feeling of precariousness, a fear that one wrong move by me or anyone else would trigger inevitable, irreparable consequences. I had no shortage of evidence that I or anyone else could become a slave with one puff of a crack pipe. How does all of this fit together? Any one of these observations could fuel a researcher's career, and there have been countless words about all of them from the perspective of virtually every discipline that exists. Yet, these analyses can't stand on their own. They need to be pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle. Their answers need to be situated with a complete theory of addiction. This is the realm of philosophy. Consider the most basic question: what is addiction? Is it a chemical dependency or a brain disorder? Is it an unhealthy reaction to trauma or weakness of will? If it's some or all of these at the same time, is it more than one than the other? For example, if we fix our brain, will that override our habituation? I've known addicts who gave up crack simply by moving out of my neighborhood. If it was so easy for one person to walk away, why was it so hard for others? Consider another set of questions. How much responsibility do people have for their own addiction? Are they to be blamed for their first use of narcotics when they should have known better? Or are they subservient to physiology inherited from their parents? Is a drunk driver more guilty if they kill someone after willingly getting into a car? Or are they less guilty because chemical dependency is more powerful than the social pressure to call a taxi? Here's yet another set of questions. How accountable is the political system for the addicts it enables? Recall that it was my entire neighborhood that cultivated the crack epidemic, not just a clump of people. The police looked the other way. The city segregated a vulnerable population. The kids sold drugs because they couldn't get jobs that would fulfill the needs the gangs did. Not to mention that to be American is to exist in a culture of addiction. As a kid, I saw countless commercials for Cocoa Puffs and Trix cereal, both of whom had mascots that would lie, steal, and booby trap to get their hands on those sugar bombs. The only desire that mattered, I learned early on, was the one you'd sacrifice everything to satisfy. Trix may be for kids, but that rabbit was a junkie. Understanding and managing addiction involves not only answering these questions, but doing so at the same time with compatible complementary conclusions. This is what I meant by a complete theory of addiction. This is what our guest is trying to create. Today's episode explores addiction philosophically, which will necessitate being detached at some points and intimately personal at others. We'll mix the empirical and the conceptual, the objective and the subjective. Addiction is psychosocial and physiological, a cultural force and a neurological one. It's so many things that it's easy to feel overwhelmed, which makes sense given that the experience of being an addict overwhelms people's very identity. This is why we start with the experience of addiction. The most important thing to remember is also the easiest to forget. We're talking about real people, neither abstractions nor statistics. They're individuals with rights and responsibilities, what philosophers call persons. Their actions affect other real people too, not just intimate relations and not just strangers they pass on the street, but folks they never encounter who could have benefited from the resources spent to heal or fight the victims of the so called war on drugs. All of us have been denied the brilliance and insight countless people could have contributed if they weren't jonesing or hiding or just drunk and stoned. But there's one more thing. Everything I've described so far has been negative, if not terrifying. But they're willing addicts too. People who choose to embrace their substance abuse because they think it's good or preferable or just inevitable. A complete theory of addiction has to explain them too, while acknowledging that maybe restrained recreational drug use might be a nice way to spend a casual evening. Why is addiction bad? Sometimes the hardest things to explain philosophically are those that feel the most obvious. With this in mind, we shouldn't be deterred, but we should always be respectful. In this instance, philosophy is being done against a background of trauma and pain, which only makes it more urgent. And now our guest. Owen Flanagan is the James B. Duke University Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Professor of Neurobiology Emeritus at Duke University. He's written over a dozen books on the philosophy of mind and related areas. His latest, What Is It Like to Be an Addict? Understanding Substance Abuse, was published last year by Oxford University Press. Owen, welcome to Why.
Thank you, Jack. It's very nice to be here.
To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Why Radio Show, WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that others can find the show. And listen to all 18 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, whyradioshow.org. And as always, the show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions. So click donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. So, Owen, addicts and addiction memoirs tend to favor a confessional model of exploration. They expose audiences to some very private and awful stuff. You have some of this in your book. I began the show with my own version of it. Why? What does confession give us that we need to start understanding addiction?
It's a great question. And it was a great introduction overall that you just gave, Jack, to the topic.
Thank you.
I think the best way to think about what you call confession is as storytelling. One of the very most effective techniques of healing from addiction or overcoming addiction in programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous involves what we call sharing experience, strength, and hope. And what that involves for people who've never been to meetings with other addicts is sharing stories. Literally, the story of what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. So there's been a huge emphasis on describing the subjective, the interior life of the addict inside programs that are known to work to help addicts heal. Now, of course, the question is, why is that? Well, in the case of sharing among other addicts, it's not because your audience loves salacious content that they want to hear about the mayhem that the addict caused, the suffering that was part of the addiction, the specifics about craving. I mean, that is helpful because each addict's story is different in certain ways. But there are some repetitive features. So, for example, almost every addict will talk about severe craving. That is times that they really wanted to use, but the social situation didn't allow them to use, and they somehow figured out a way nonetheless to use. So part of it is, I think, sort of what confession does in general, maybe in religious contexts, which is honestly assessing what it's like to be you in a condition that you yourself don't like, that's undermining your own flourishing. The other feature, though, is helping others to identify with the problem that they have. And in some sense, going back to things like, Viennese psychology, Freud and Breuer and psychoanalysis, there's something about talking, because we're storytelling creatures, that can help with the healing and can also help, as I say, with knowing what's going on in those people in Washington Heights when you were young who were on crack cocaine. I remember that time, by the way. I had just left for Boston in the early 70s, and I went to college in the South Bronx. And I remember the New York Times every day saying there's a crack epidemic, and number two, no one's ever gotten over a crack addiction. The latter turned out to be entirely false. And if you think about it, it would have been very, very helpful if the New York Times was able to report the testimony which was already there in that community, that people were able to be addicted to crack cocaine and somehow undo the addiction, rather than tell us a false story, which is that at least no one was seeing people getting better from the addiction.
It's an interesting observation that the media covered it in the way that it did. And in the beginning of your answer, you used the word salacious. I've read a fair amount of particularly rock musician memoirs,
Yep.
and
Yep.
a lot of them feel almost pornographic, that when the musicians talk about their years of addiction, there's a competitive, my rock bottom was worse than your rock bottom aspect. And given my background, that turns me off a little bit. Where's the line between the glorification of the war story and the honesty that allows us to see that this is recoverable from? How do we empathize and learn and tell the experiences without furthering the inherent exploitation that's implicit in them?
In fact, I just finished a biography of the Rolling Stones last week, and I have read Keith Richards' book Life a few years ago. And he's an example I use in the book of what I call a willing addict. A willing addict is roughly someone who, like you said at the beginning, finds that their drug of choice is, all things considered, best for them. So normally, for your average addict, one of the ways in which you can define addiction is that the relationship to the substance, or it could be an activity like gambling or internet addiction or sex addiction, that the activity, the behavior of engaging the substance, etc., undermines what they want most for their life. Now, you could easily see that having happened to someone like Keith Richard, if in fact he couldn't write music or he couldn't play music. And again, in this most recent biography that I read of the band, he was that way. He did make a determination that, all things considered, this was okay for him. And of course, he was able to get very high quality pharmaceutical grade heroin, etc. What's so disturbing about the book is that everyone else in his life and in the band who had drug problems, Mick Jagger didn't, or not much. He was a recreational user. You're right that there's this, there are these cases where people survive their addictions, they even do okay with their addiction, but the number of casualties alongside them is usually pretty high. So I don't know the answer to your question about what becomes just for salacious public consumption. It would be bad if stories of these rare cases like Keith Richard attracted young people to think this might be for me, as opposed to the reaction you had, Jack, when you were worried that you might have an addictive personality, whatever exactly that means. What did you mean by that, by the way?
That is a good question, right? And growing up, not just my neighborhood, it's family members and that go back generations. And there is this sense, right, that I discussed, that it's just lurking. It's the monster that follows you, that it's not. This goes back to one of the central questions, which we'll talk about in a little bit after the break, which is how much of this is the consequence of trauma? How much of this is the consequence of culture? How much of this is the consequence of physiology that some people describe taking a drug and that first experience being almost like, oh my God, where have you been all my life? And that was
Right.
that was the thing that I was afraid of the most. And because of the circumstance I was in, the fear of losing control was also exacerbated the issues, right? So it wasn't just the addiction, it was the need to have a certain kind of control. And one of the things, I mean, we're going to be honest on this episode. One of the things that I have discussed with my therapists for many, many, many years is this deep-seated fear that the rug is going to be pulled out of me at any moment, that the center does not hold, that the foundation will fall apart, depending on what metaphor you want. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about the people in the sphere, like her last name is Pallenberg, like Anita Pallenberg,
Right.
who that addiction is contagious in a certain way, and there are these ripple effects. So let me ask you this question. John Stuart Mill, 19th century philosopher, famously talked about self-regarding actions, actions that only affect the person involved. And one of the examples that I often bring up in class for this to get the students to think about it is the guy who's smoking a bowl on his couch one Saturday evening, right? Just getting stoned by yourself in the house. Is it ever possible to think about addiction as a self-regarding action, as something that only hurts yourself, the way that, say, libertarians might describe it? Or is addiction inherently interpersonal and necessarily involving other people, even if we don't have specific people to name?
So the first thing I would do in responding to that, let me say one thing about the personality trait research. There is this concept out there that you used, addictive personality. When people have looked for what personality traits go with addiction, they're not going to be the single cause of it. They tend not to find any. The closest one of the big five personality traits is novelty seeking or adventurousness. Now you can see how that would work, right? Because the kid in the neighborhood might be one of the first ones out there trying the new thing. The new thing could be skateboarding, it could be bungee diving, whatever the ice climbing. You get the picture of a certain kind of personality that is more open to new experiences. And that's thought to be one of the big five personality traits. It's not highly correlated for reasons I can get into, which has to do with the fact that you might say people who are also very private sometimes want to comfort themselves in their loneliness. So that will be also for a different kind of personality. But you get some small correlation with adventurousness. But the main thing, as you said, is social environment. So the fact that all the Rolling Stones or the people around them, except for Mick Jagger, and he did try heroin, he just didn't get addicted to it, were using is a social contagion phenomenon. We had a great basketball player at Duke who I taught in summer school once, and I had the kids over for a barbecue. And he was telling me his story about it, living in East St. Louis. And he said the reason he was there at Duke playing basketball was because the day he tried crack cocaine on the basketball court, he had a terrible asthma attack and he didn't go back. He said every other player he played with didn't have an asthma attack. And you could fill out the rest of the story. And they were better
That's
than him.
really interesting. That's a
Yeah.
really interesting story.
Yeah. So you can luck out in weird ways. The other thing, to go address your Mill question about self-regarding behavior, is that it can be very helpful to distinguish between addiction and heavy recreational use. One reason I insist upon that in the book is that actually, economically, most of the social costs of drug use are not from addictive drug use. There are things like stupid people getting in cars and causing accidents, or people whose health goes downhill because they have a bad diet and drink too much. But who could stop tomorrow? And they make an overall assessment that this is, on balance, a good thing for their life. One of the tricky parts is the way that I define addiction, and I think the way the psychiatric community tends to define it, is that it's a relationship, as I said, to a substance which overall undermines your very own ends. Like if you, Jack, had started using crack cocaine when it was available to you in Washington Heights, you wouldn't have accomplished what you have accomplished. You wouldn't be a philosopher if you got addicted to it. I mean, you might have tried it recreationally and been okay. And there are plenty of people who use every single drug of abuse recreationally without getting addicted. Now, that makes the story much more complicated, doesn't it? Because it goes back to the question you raised at the very beginning. Why do we use drugs? And one answer is they're fun. They make you feel good. They recreate interesting experiences. They can chill you out. They can make you more socially adept. So there's a ton of reasons why we like drugs. And of course, that's without getting into the pain relief and so on and so forth.
We have to take a break. And when we come back, I want to talk about addiction as a pathology and some of the politics behind addiction, and we'll then start to unravel your theory of addiction and the things that you describe in the book. But before that, you are listening to Owen Flanagan and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We're talking to Owen Flanagan and taking a philosophical look at addiction. And Owen, before we continue the conversation, I guess I want to ask a rhetorical question, although it's probably deeper than that. When we talk about people with addiction, if we call them addicts, are we objectifying them? Are we making them disappear? How important, I guess, both in your view and in the overriding discourse, is the rhetoric of addiction? Because we know that in the deaf community, there's a debate about hearing impaired and is someone deaf, or is a person have deafness? Is someone autistic? Does a person have autism, right? There's all this huge political linguistic stuff that's on the surface of the debate. Does that exist in this discussion? And how controversial is it? And what's your position?
The answer to this question brings me to one of the important features of listening to addicts themselves. So, what's happened in the public health discourse over the last 40 years is that people have said exactly what you just said. Calling someone an addict objectifies them, stigmatizes them, shames them, guilt trips them, and so on and so forth. And what's happened is that there's a suggestion that we should change the discourse and refer to people as substance abusers. Now, that was the first move. In a recent US Surgeon General's report, the report is titled something like Substance Abuse and Addiction in America. Then in the first 15 pages, it tells you that we no longer call people like Owen Flanagan addicts or former addicts. We call him a substance abuser or former substance abuser. Then about 15 pages later, you get a footnote which says we no longer use the word substance abuser. We call Flanagan a substance misuser. Now, I think this is just silly. And most addicts I know think it's silly too. First of all, if the condition itself is undesirable, and it is usually being an addict, that is, not being a drug user necessarily. If it is undesirable, then it already is, in some sense, socially stigmatized, including in the mind of the addict himself. Furthermore, most addicts, in at least building in rooms of AA and NA, Narcotics Anonymous, introduce themselves as, I am Owen, I'm an alcoholic and an addict, or I'm Owen, I'm an addict. The community itself is perfectly happy to use the traditional term, I am an addict, I have an addiction, that sort of thing. And so I think it's just silly for an external community, the community that tries to treat or help, to decide on what the linguistic use should be.
As a footnote, for those who haven't read the book, I do want to acknowledge that you begin the book with your own narrative in your own discussion of addiction and recovery. I think that's important for people to know, particularly because of the examples that you were giving, so that you're coming from a place of experience and personal insight as well as philosophical insight. When you talk about this division between substance abuser and substance misuser and addict, and when I hear this phrase, substance abuser, for example, it feels like a fundamentally different category than addict. So is addiction a quantitative distinction or a qualitative distinction? Is it just that you are using a lot more and therefore there are more life consequences? Or is there a line where you're no longer abusing or misusing? The experience is something fundamentally, or let's say essentially different, that makes it qualitatively different as opposed to quantitatively different.
And I think there I would have to say we would need both the science of addiction, that is the objective sciences that study addiction, brain science, metabolic science, which I'll say something about maybe in a minute, to be further along before we knew if there's something like a threshold, like a quantitative threshold. Let me give an example. I haven't written about this, but I've been thinking about it. Take something like heating and cooling water. You might think, okay, so the water gets colder and colder and colder, and all of a sudden it reaches 32 degrees, and there's what we call a phase change. It becomes ice. Or you go in the other direction. It gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And then all of a sudden there's a phase change to it boils. It's boiling water. It could be that addiction is a little bit like that. You can cross thresholds. And once you cross the threshold, I'm thinking this is something quantitative, then you just have trouble stopping. You're jonesing all the time. You really need the substance. Your body's in massive withdrawal, things like that. So it could be, if we were to look very closely, that there might be an amount of liquor, say, that if you drink it every single day, your body will cross some threshold that we'll be able to quantitatively describe. It also, though, crosses a threshold that is qualitative, that the addict herself or himself will notice. So when people talk about, gee, it's 5 o'clock, I need a drink, they're not just doing something that is sort of the thing they do at the end of the day, like changing into slippers, like in the old TV shows. They're actually doing something that their body might well want because it's out of the stuff that it expects every 24 hours at cocktail hour. So these are some of the understudied questions in the whole field that we don't know enough yet. And one reason I mentioned the metabolic case, everybody's been reading about these GLP-1 drugs for weight loss and diabetes and things like that. Those are really interesting because they seem to have effect on desire for drugs among addicts. And the explanation for that has to be something largely metabolic because these things affect intestinal hormones first and foremost. That's kind of interesting. In fact, there's articles in the paper this week about a whole other phenomena, which is taking fecal samples from people who are not addicts and doing fecal transplants in addicts and it having some effect on lowering the amount of jonesing or craving. So that means that you've got a whole body metabolic thingamajig going on. And there's a lot of research to be done in that area.
So this brings together two questions that I can now ask as one. And as a background for our listeners, the philosopher Michel Foucault uses the example of homosexuality to talk about the pathologizing and medicalization of certain behaviors, that being a homosexual was regarded as sick and a psychiatric disorder and an illness, and then society decided it wasn't, and there are other examples. There's also a discussion, and I've heard Dan Savage, very, very famous and important cultural figure and sex advice columnist, he's been on the show, and he argues that sex addiction is not a real addiction because there's no chemical change in the body. And you, in your book, you have some chemistry and you talk about the way that alcohol molecules interact with molecules in our physiology to have some reaction. So the question that I have is addiction a sort of cultural construct and invention that we've medicalized, and therefore it's perfectly fine to call sex addiction an addiction because addiction is anything we say it is? Or does there have to be some sort of chemical, material, you just use the word metabolic component of it, because there has to be some kind of physical dependency as well as psychological dependency? How much control does a culture have in, I'll say fairly and justly, having a specific definition of addiction?
Most people distinguish between substance addictions and behavioral addictions. And I try to think mostly, because that's where my expertise is, about substance addictions. But you're totally right. And the Foucault point is important. Lots of people now with sort of average, ordinary sex lives. There are those beer commercials where the dating couple sits down and the woman says to the guy, I think it is, how many have there been before me? And he starts to get sheepish and he puts up two fingers. She thinks he's saying just two, but he's ordering two beers. Okay.
I haven't seen that. But
so now, the point being that in the culture that you and I grew up in, like most people by 19th century standards are sex addicts, or certainly were sex addicts and then got over it, I guess, maybe if we settle down into, right? But we just don't think of, like, in fact, even the word promiscuity has sort of gone away. So that's a good example, I think, Foucault's example and your example, of where the phenomenon isn't described as bad or unusual or weird or okay. Now, sure, there might be still some people who themselves feel that their sexual behavior undermines their own flourishing. And there I usually go with whatever the person themselves says goes. So they have, if they can't stop themselves from having sex all the time, if it interferes with relationships they're trying to sustain, then they have a problem. Now, they could figure it out, I guess, in the old way of being a Dionysian. They could just say, okay, that's the way I am, and give up these certain other ends. With respect to the substance addictions, I think what typically happens is that the person starts to feel physically sick. And there are often physical side effects to, like, the liver in the case of alcohol, or liver in the case of hepatitis that you get from IV drugs, heart problems, cocaine, for example. When you go into rehab, they really check the cocaine users because they've often had silent heart attacks. So in those cases, it looks more, as it were, objective, and from the inside, it's a problem. But you bring up the very important cases where from the outside, we might say she has a sex addiction, but from the inside, she might just feel I have an active sexual life. And I would there defer to the person herself. The one other thing I wanted to say about this question that you just raised, we see it right now, Jack, with the buzz about hallucinogens and psilocybin and things like that, return of LSD. I have nothing against these drugs, and they don't look to be physically very addictive. Nonetheless, if you take psilocybin and drive a car, there's a problem. But right now, because it's mostly something that well off white people are doing, it's being introduced as a form of mental hygiene, yoga, spiritual perfection. So you're totally right that the opposite side of the way crack cocaine was talked about in the Black community when you were a boy is the entire opposite of the way these new drugs are being described, because the community taking them is different. They're less scary to us. They seem to have more control over it, that sort of thing. One final thing on this is just that one of the old definitions of addiction emphasized physical dependence, meaning that if you go off the drug, you'll have terrible withdrawal effects. Now, you have those with alcohol and with heroin, for example. Some people think you have less of it with cocaine. The interesting thing is, almost all pharmaceutical drugs that we take, like antidepressants, benzodiazepines, have terrible withdrawal effects if you go off them right away. So you have to titrate carefully off those. But that's been a case, using Foucaultian language, where the medical community has said, because we distribute these drugs, which your body needs, and which if you don't give it, you'll Jones, it's not an addiction. So all the social forces you're talking about in the Foucaultian spirit are involved in these cases.
There's so much in there, particularly the distinction between legal and illegal being treated analogously as addictive and non-addictive, and the powers that be in the corporations and medical establishment. And hopefully we'll come back to that. There's also a discussion that we need to have, which I'm going to put off for a couple minutes, about class and social capital, because you mentioned that these new, more experimental psychotropic microdosing and things like that are well off white people. And you make the argument that social capital is the best predictor of whether a person is going to have high well-being or not. And this amazing statistic, I don't remember the exact one, that while white people have a significantly higher instance of addiction, folks in the Black community have a much lower recovery rate, and that has to be unpacked. But in order to figure out how all this puts together and to make sense of this phrase that you keep using, undermining our flourishing, being, shooting ourselves in the foot for what we want in life, I think it's important to contrast this with what a theory of addiction looks like. And in the book, you highlight three main theories of addiction: self-medication, social dislocation, and universal dopamine. Can you shortly tell us what those are so that we can understand what you're responding to, right? These are the three dominant theories as to what addiction is, and once we know what addiction is, how to treat it and how to manage it. But there are problems with them. So social medication, social dislocation, and universal dopamine.
Good.
What are those, and how do they explain addiction?
These are the three dominant models. And if there are people who put all their eggs in one basket, these are the three baskets that they put all their eggs in sometimes. Okay. So one is the self-medication hypothesis is roughly this kind of thing. Suppose you're a person who is shy and anxious. Well, you take a sip of Daddy's Martini when you're 9 years old, and you notice that you feel less scared and anxious. Or you're 20 years old and you're about to enter into your first psychotic state because you have schizophrenia. That's what it usually appears. That looks like a genetic disease, by the way. And you find that nicotine calms you down, or you find that drinking calms you down. That either makes you less psychotic or makes you less concerned about your psychosis. These would be self-medication hypothesis. There's some psychological problem or issue you're having, could range widely, manic depressive, anxious, etc. And you take it because your drug, because you find it either calms the storm or, I don't know, dulls your reaction to it. So that's one common view, that all addiction is self-medication. The objection to that right out of the gate is that a lot of people like what the drugs do to them and they have no underlying problem. Keith Richard might be an example. It just makes me really feel better. I think Churchill said the same thing about drinking. Overall, it sort of enhanced his life. So there are many, many people who start using drugs not to avoid a problem, but to enhance experiences of various sorts, sexual experiences, whatever. And I see this all the time. Like I was reading about some Tony Awards, maybe it was in the paper, and they talked about the party afterwards and the champagne flowing. Now, those people are, maybe they often drink too much, and they party too much by some standards, but they're not self-medicating. They're doing something like enhancing experiences. The social dislocation hypothesis is that usually people had some kind of problem adjusting socially, particularly they're not able to hold jobs down, whatever. They end up poor, they end up under a bridge, and they're socially dislocated. The person in the next bed over to them says, I've got this thing. It's either a powder or a pill. They don't even care what it is. Would you take it? I would take it. Yeah. So that explains some cases. And those would also explain the cases, not according to social dislocation, but take well-off white people like myself who started drinking because everybody had cocktail hour in Westchester County. Everybody did. And I wasn't socially dislocated, but I was subject to social contagion, and I became really good at it. So again, it'll explain some cases. The third one, the universal dopamine hypothesis, says that every single case, whether it's a sex addict, a heroin addict, a gambling addict, they all suffer the same underlying neurological problem, which is that their midbrain dopamine system is whacked out. And there, the focus would be on forget about the social causes, forget about the internal psyche of the person. What I need to do is get in there and fix or circumvent the defunct dopamine system. The reason that one doesn't hold up is just if you look at the underlying neurobiology, many more systems are involved than the dopamine system. There are over 100 neurotransmitters. They all seem to be involved somehow or other. So all of them as universal theses just don't do the job.
Is addiction a special case when it comes to this kind of explanation? And what I mean by this is philosophers in particular, we like looking for a single cause for stuff. And it's almost never the case because in reality, there's never just one cause for anything. And we just have to map a complex universe and complex human behavior and all that sort of stuff. And we have a mind and we have a body. So there's going to be multiple causes. Are these unsatisfying just because in general, single universal explanations are unsatisfying? Or do they not work for particular reasons related to addiction, and that addiction is a special kind of complexity that requires a special kind of multifaceted approach? How different is the explanation of addiction as opposed to the explanation of other scientific or physical phenomena?
The easiest way for me to approach that question is also a little bit simplistic, but I can say this much. One problem is exactly what you said, Jack, which is that monocausal explanations tend to underwhelm when you look at the details. So that's the general problem you refer to. However, I think addiction is a unusual case for the following reason. And this is why I get concerned about people who insist on calling it a disease, or other people say, I insist on calling it a dysfunction, or I insist on calling it a disability, is that it can start in so many different ways. So for example, I think 2012 was the year in which more drug overdoses were caused by prescription drugs than by illicit drugs in the United States. That is prescription opioids because of the pain epidemic, Sackler, et cetera. We did something really humane. We started to take seriously that we should really treat physical pain. Then we know that the Sackler family had done a disgraceful job of advertising their particular drug, OxyContin, as non-addictive, when it was obvious to anyone that it was addictive right out of the gate. Now that led to what people call iatrogenic addiction, namely caused by doctors. If you include SSRIs, which so many of us take, benzodiazepines, which many of us take, there are lots of drugs which were prescribed on which we're physically dependent. And if we take too many of them, we can overdose, kill ourselves, die accidentally, etc. Other things that we get addicted to, everything from legal alcohol, can sneak up on you. But it involves the choices of the agent herself. So what I mean by that simply is that I was not well educated in the dangers of alcohol. My social context was one in which alcohol was involved in every baptism, every confirmation, every wedding. There were beautiful drinks that the women had at Christmas time with cherries in them. The men had beautiful drinks with olives in them. It was just a mysterious, beautiful part of life. Now, no one participates in getting high cholesterol, say, with the same set of social cues. I mean, maybe it's the case that if you eat a lot of the wrong kind of foods, as we say, you will get high cholesterol, you get hardening of the arteries, and so on and so forth. But there's not usually an attraction to the end state or something in the vicinity of the end state. But in the case of using drugs, you're actually trying to get unusual experiences. So the addict participates him or herself in the creation of the very ailment that they end up having, which is, as I describe it, is the undermining their own flourishing, shooting themselves in the foot, as you put it. So there's much more agent participation in developing an addiction. And on the other side, one reason that undermines the universal hypothesis is that the agent also has to be more involved than with typical ailments in undoing the problem. That is, you can't just go to a doctor and get statins to lower your cholesterol. You can't get this similar kind of thing for alcoholism or drug addiction. You actually have to do all sorts of things, from tying yourself to the mast so you're not tempted by the sirens, going into rehab, taking other drugs to mitigate the terrible effects of craving and so on. So it has this personal component of acquisition and getting rid of it. And then it also involves identity in a way these other diseases or problems don't. That is, one can become, that being one of the boys is smoking crack on the basketball court in St. Louis. Not because you want to be an addict, but because you want to be one of the boys. Or in my case, drinking was just part of the fabric of everyday social life. And I miss that part. So it's identity constitutive in certain ways. So I think the answer to your question is it's so much more involves the person level acquisition, and getting rid of it involves person level actions that makes it very, very different from normal, say, physical diseases.
I think it's really easy because we are so familiar with alcohol and drinking and social situations to pass by the description you gave of the Westchester cocktail party without understanding the power of it. And two stories came to mind. One is an analogous one, and one is something that actually happened. I struggle, as long-term listeners know, with depression, and there was a period of about a year when I insisted, like most academics, the vast majority of my friends and the people I socialize with work at my university. And I insisted that no one was allowed to talk about work with me, that I just couldn't handle it, and I needed to talk about other things. And when I made that rule, it was so much harder to talk to me because the basic social lubricant of complaining about our colleagues and, moaning about the stupid decisions that the administrators make, we don't have that in common anymore. And it got met with a silence. And I think that that's a really nice analogy, I hope, of the silence that happens when you don't have the alcohol lubricant. And it reminded me of something that happened in college. I was at a party, and a woman who I'm still friends with named Amy came up to me. Turned out, she wanted to meet me and blah, blah. And she came up to me and she had a beer in her hand and I didn't have anything in my hand. And she asked me where my beer was. And I said, I don't drink. And she stopped and she looked at me and she put her beer on the floor and she said, "You're my hero." Now, it's almost 40 years later, and the permission that she gave me to be myself was so liberating. And I bring up those two stories because it shows just how powerful these social expectations and structures and habits are, that the act of operating against it is itself an act of tremendous will. And so with that in mind, you object to the idea of calling it a disease, but aren't people going to respond, if it's not a disease, you're blaming the victim? This is something that people don't have control over. They have inherited genetics. They have tremendous social pressure, as I described. Addiction is not your fault. And if you take away the pathological language, the language of disease, you are just blaming, shaming, and ostracizing the victim. How do you respond to that?
So it isn't that I think it's, as it were, objectively wrong to call addiction a disease. I get all the reasons that people have for calling it a disease. I prefer to call it a disorder. And one reason I give for why I prefer to call it a disorder is that one thing we're certain about is that addicts have a relationship to a substance that undermines their own flourishing. That is, and what I just mean by that is something, if you want to study hard to get into medical school and you find yourself addicted to heroin or cocaine or alcohol in college so that you can't study, you're undermining your own flourishing. Or if you want to be in a relationship with someone who is not addicted to drugs, who doesn't approve of your addiction to drugs, but you're nonetheless behaving in a way that shows you're addicted, then I think you're undermining your own flourishing. So again, it doesn't come back to what the external community says, but in some sense, what from the first person point of view undermines your flourishing. The other reason I don't love the word disease, is that it's not like, as I say, type 1 diabetes, where you're born with a pancreas that doesn't produce enough insulin. It's more like type 2 diabetes, which is under an agent's control. Now, of course, we do think of type 2 diabetes as a disease, and we know how to treat it. And sometimes the agent has to do things like change her diet and so on. Okay. It is similar to some disease, and it's not similar to every disease or canonical disease. So I don't fuss over the fact if people use the word disease. You asked the question, though, are we blaming people for something that, in fact, was unavoidable given their life history, their genes, their social context, and so on and so forth? And there I do think we have to be thoughtful and compassionate. There is almost always a causal explanation that we can sketch for why a particular individual became addicted. At a certain point, they just started to use a dose of the substance that put them into a metabolic state that they keep needing the substance. And they don't have the social resources to worm their way out of it. And the correlation that you mentioned earlier between social class and thus with economic status and thus with race for healing should be enough evidence for us to see that these causal determinants keep certain groups of people from getting the help that they need and help other people, rich white people like myself, from getting help. So I hope that we can do it without medicalizing everything, because I don't think that the medical community has so far shown itself to be very effective or helpful with helping people get out of addiction. And one reason for that is that there are no pills or drugs of any sort which work on the dopamine system to help people overcome that problem, if that is the problem. There are some drugs which help people with cravings, and those we should use as much as we possibly can. But there's also the fact that therapeutic groups are probably more effective. And by that, I mean Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. And those involve going to rooms with other people who you're going to hear share their experience, strength, and hope. So again, if it has primarily social causes, then the way out looks to be primarily social. Be among people like your friend who also puts the beer down.
in a minute, I want to ask you about Alcoholics Anonymous, because you have a fascinating discussion about that, and there's going to be a connection to that with my question. But before then, I guess I want to ask, how much does the philosophical conversation and your description of addiction being an action that undermines your flourishing, how much does it run counter to the institutional and bureaucratic needs, right? I think about, there are people who complain because the AMA considers pregnancy an illness, and they say, it's the most natural thing in the world. How could it be an illness? But one of the reasons why it's an illness is that then they can put a code on the billing system and insurance can cover certain aspects of it. And so much of this stuff is about managing the medical infrastructure, the billing, the treatment, and how our government institutions can provide or not provide assistance. If you define addiction as something that undermines your flourishing, you can't really put that on a medical form. So how much of this or therapy, right? I'm sort of answering my own question, but American healthcare likes to pay for pills because then pharmaceutical companies make money. Our medical system does not like to pay for therapy for the obvious reason. So is there a political necessity to have a medicalized definition, if for no other reason than it allows us to access, manipulate, exploit, whatever word you use, the healthcare industry in a way that would ultimately benefit addicts, that something more social, more amorphous, like undermining your flourishing, wouldn't do?
There is very good work on exactly this question. In fact, I'm reading a book right now about, I'm reaching for it here. It's called Policing Patients, Treatment and Surveillance on the Front Lines of the Opioid Crisis. And it's a very interesting book about exactly the sort of thing you raised. So think about something like this. In the olden days, barbers also were surgeons, especially I go to a dermatologist all the time because I got a lot of sunburn as a kid. Well, in the olden days, if I went to the barber, he would remove little doodads, which probably at that time were basal cell or squamous cell carcinomas. Well, that got removed to dermatology, and that's for the best, I think. But what has happened, you're right, is that there are all these bureaucracies, and there are multiple ones. So one is the Food and Drug Administration, which of course does serve a very, very important role of making sure that the foods we eat don't contain salmonella, and that also watch out for drugs which are very dangerous and prohibits them. Now, that's not necessary that they prohibit them. They could just say these are highly restricted. Actually, fentanyl is a good example because fentanyl is highly restricted and is very dangerous. But the ways in which the institutions of pharmaceuticals, both pharmaceutical companies and then pharmacists themselves, there are surveillance techniques that track how people go for opioids in particular, or benzodiazepines, other good drugs of addiction. And we think of these as, in Foucaultian terms, as something like undesirable behaviors that are moralized and so on and so forth. So I think it's just certainly true that the addictions have come under the purview of medicine, psychiatry in particular, but not psychology or psychotherapy or social work. They could have gone that route. So I think the story you tell is perfectly plausible, that It's considered, because it's an illness or a disease, it's considered primarily in medical terms. And now that's what's interesting about it, however, is that the law enforcement institutions that then treat what they call addiction don't distinguish between addiction and what you might call irresponsible use. So many people who are convicted of, say, drunk driving are not alcoholics, but they go to drug courts, and drug courts demand that they get treatment. Now, you could say that's plausible, because back to the previous question that you asked, these things might occur on a continuum. So if you're a responsible user, you might be on your way to addiction. Anyway, I feel like I'm rummaging around, just really agreeing with the point that you made about these large institutional forces, which have now put addiction, the treatment of addiction, in the home of medicine. But I don't think that's necessarily the best place for it.
There's no greater enemy to philosophy radio than agreement. We don't have too much more time, but we have to talk about Alcoholics Anonymous because it's such an important institution in recovery. You have a whole chapter dedicated to it, although it's interwoven in the book. And I'll set up the problem in this way. We were talking about the ways in which pain medication was marketed by the Sacklers, and it becomes very, very easy to see the conspiracy, to see the self-interest on the profit seekers in this. When you talk about AA, one of the things that AA says is you're never not an addict. You may be in recovery, you may be in control, but you're always an addict and you have to deal with that. And the cynic in me said, of course, Alcoholics Anonymous wants to say you're always an addict because then AA is always going to be in business. We're just in the pocket of big AA. Now, that's a caricature. But how powerful is AA? How much does AA define our vision, the imagination about addiction? And to what extent is AA more successful, or are they just another player that, like I said, is sort of interested in advancing their own aims and their own visions of what addiction is?
One reason why I think that medicine is not the right place to think about treatment for addiction at this point in time, it's because of the following. When addicts do show up in the offices of medical doctors or are in trouble with the law, both medicine and legal institutions normally require them to get treatment in something that looks surprisingly like AA. In fact, sometimes it is AA, although there's a legal case in the last 10 or 15 years which said you had to give people a secular option to AA for treatment. But again, the secular options almost always involve techniques that are used in AA. You meet with other people who are also addicts, and you share your experience, strength, and hope, and you do cognitive behavioral therapy on yourself to figure out what are the things that activate your desire to use, what are the social situations you should stay out of that you're prone to vulnerability to, and so on and so forth. So the solution is almost always social, not medical at this time. That is, pills are not given. Okay, now, so number one is most people, despite denying that this is anything other than a medical disease, still send people to group therapy, broadly construed, because that's what AA is and NA is. The next question, though, is you might have this, I'll give an analogy. Maybe once the Roman Catholic Church, which I was raised in, was a completely philanthropic organization, but it hasn't been for a long time. Because if you go to Rome in the Vatican, you see an awful lot of gold. So maybe it was Domini, 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 now give me your gold. There's a lot of that. So we know that institutions that start out as purely philanthropic, maybe, or charitable, usually become very, very self-interested in their own perpetuation and growing themselves into something financially powerful. I don't think AA has done that. Now, that's remarkable in itself because it means that the people who go to these meetings, when the basket goes around, are usually to this day only putting $1 or $2 into the basket for an hour of group therapy. There is no place else in the world where you can get group therapy for less than that. And the price hasn't gone up. So this is kind of remarkable to me that there is such an institution. Now, however, you might just say, though, isn't Jack right that AA wants everybody to keep coming back? And I think the answer is yes. They want alcoholics and addicts to keep coming back. But I think it's because they believe that it's a prophylactic against relapse. Sincerely believe that. Now, this relates to your question about the idea in AA that once an addict, always an addict. Whether that's true or not depends a lot on how the brain and metabolism stories end up. What I can say is this. I once had a relapse after 7 years of abstinence. And by the end of that week, when I went back out, I was drinking at the same level I had been 7 years before. Now, that's kind of weird, but a lot of people describe relapses that way, that it was like the elevator kept going down and you got back on it at a lower floor. That requires some kind of physiological explanation, it looks like, and we don't have it yet. But that's the argument that many people give for why you are always in danger of reactivating your disease. So it goes with that sort of family of ways of describing the phenomenon to make you think that you still have it. I think it's a little bit like the way we use the language of remission in cancer. You know, people go 20 years or so, but they say, oh, she's in remission, but then we say her breast cancer is back again. So I think that is the model and the analogy that's used. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. That's why I say at the beginning of the book, I don't know whether to describe myself as an addict who doesn't use for 20 years or whether I'm an addict in remission. I don't think that we know how to answer that question clearly.
It is always illustrative when such a complex and sophisticated conversation ends with the trademarked philosophy, I don't know. But there is so much that we don't know here, including, you say in passing that what we know about AA is that it is at least as effective as other treatments. There is so much more to talk about. And of course, this is a conversation that people have over a lifetime. And we have to stop somewhere. And as the host of the party, this is where I have to stop. I want to say, though, to you and to our audience that I think it's tremendously remarkable and generous of you to work so hard in the field of addiction when you have your own history, because the layers of desire and risk and all of that sort of stuff, it's got to be present in some way, even when you're writing a book. And I have to say, I admire it, and I admire your honesty and thoughtfulness. And The book was a fascinating read for me because it really helped me. It provided a vocabulary and a structure for me to think about aspects of my own experience and the experience of people I love that I didn't have before. So, Owen, thank you so much for joining us on Why, and thank you so much for being so forthright with us.
And thank you, Jack. It was a wonderful conversation.
You have been listening to Owen Flanagan and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why, Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. I'll be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyinpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why, Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We were talking with Owen Flanagan about his book, What Is It Like to Be an Addict? Having a philosophical conversation about a difficult topic that is often discussed in the most bureaucratic, medicinal ways or with tremendous emotion amongst people who love each other and are afraid for each other's well-being. And I torn about how to end this because I've got other stories that I want to tell and all of that. But I guess I want to end by mentioning there's a television series, a sitcom called Mom, that follows a mother and daughter who are both alcoholics and drug addicts, and with good humor. And Allison Janney, who is one of the best American actors, the struggles, the humor, the absurdity, and the sadness of addiction. And what's particularly interesting about the show is that they are very, very avid AA attendees. And the conceit of the characters, at least, is that AA is the only way to manage this, and that it is a medical, neurological brain disease that they always have, but that it has to be tempered with behavior. And it is a very interesting way of trying to negotiate all of the different threads that we discussed today. How much responsibility do addicts have? How biological is the disease? How influence is the social structure? How guilty is our society? How are individual relationships cultivated by and undermined by these addictions? And the thing that I think is the most apropos to our conversation is that while this conversation is entirely present in all of the episodes, it just looks like human beings living their life. It is impossible to parse what a person did because they're dysfunctional, and what a person did because their body told them, and what a person did because of the social expectations. And that, in the end, is the greatest analytic difficulty, the greatest philosophical difficulty in trying to make sense of addiction, because no matter how complicated it is, the experience of it as a human being is intuitive, instantaneous, and all lumped together. And all we can do is feel overwhelmed by the emotions and the consequences of that amorphous thing that we call addiction. Owen describes addiction as behavior that undermines your own flourishing. And that is a great way to end the discussion. Ask yourself, Is what you are doing now preventing you from doing what you want to do most? And once you have that answer, you have an agenda for the future. This has been Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Thank you for listening. As always, it's an honor to be with you.
Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is a monthly radio show on Prairie Public Radio, part of the National Public Radio Network. Why Radio is a production of the University of North Dakota's Institute for Philosophy and Public Life. It's broadcast on the second Sunday of every month, and an extended version with more than 30 minutes of extra discussion is available for free as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast services. Please rate and review us and share us with your friends. Follow us on the usual social networks. Our handle is always @Y Radio Show. That's @WHY Radio Show. Instagram is our most active platform. Our free archive with close to 2 decades worth of episodes is available on our website, yradioshow.org. Visit to learn more about us, our sister show, Philosophical Currents, and IPPL's other projects. Please go to yradioshow.org to make your tax-deductible donation via UND's Alumni Association. Click on the blue Donate button in the upper right-hand corner. Jack Russell Weinstein is our host. Teante Calloway is our engineer and editor. Why's music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Lua y Sol. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com. Why Radio is copyright Jack Russell Weinstein and funded as a partnership of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life and Prairie Public Broadcasting. IPPL is an academic unit of the University of North Dakota College of Arts and Sciences. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we have inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.